Firefly, a 2002 live-action television series created under the Mutant Enemy production team, is easily my favorite live-action television series of all time. A few weeks ago, I did a video where I talked about television shows that jump the shark, and I basically made the argument that the longer a show lasts, the more likely it is to jump the shark. I believe I also said that Firefly, which only lasted for 14 episodes, 3 of which didn't even air during its runtime, is a perfect television show because it never had a chance to get crappy and jump the shark. So after making a statement like that, I thought it'd be a good idea to test that and see if this show really is all it's cracked up to be. After all, I think that the DC animated universe that consists of shows like Batman the Animated Series, Batman Beyond, and Justice League Unlimited is a really fantastic and fertile world of imagination and greatness, but there are occasional duds in those series, as I'm finding out in my bi-weekly reviews of episodes of Batman the Animated Series. So I thought I'd see if Firefly is maybe not as great as it is in my mind. So I will be attempting to review each episode of this series in a somewhat timely manner, followed by a review of the movie, and then following that, possibly the review for Serenity, A Shepherd's Tale. I've had that graphic novel for over a month, and I've been wanting to read it and review it for this channel for a little while, but I figured I would tackle the series first. I've actually wanted to do something like this for quite a while. Review a television series episode by episode and really dive into the long-term character arcs and how the characters change and grow over time. I am actually much more of a fan of long-form storytelling as opposed to standalone stories. I get that they are different things, but if done right, a television series will do so much more for me than a 2-hour movie, even a movie that is exceptionally good. I think it's the plot threads that can be set up early and paid off weeks or even months later, and the growth and progression of characters that you just don't get to see much in the limited time span of a movie. Granted, when a television series is bad, these things can become infuriating when the show drops the ball. So this experience will not only, hopefully, be fun for any of you who are fans of this television series and fans of one of the creators, Joss Whedon, but it will also be fun for me because I really love this kind of storytelling. So enough of the prologue, let me get into the review for the 2-hour pilot of this series called Serenity, not to be confused with the theatrical movie that came in 2005, also called Serenity. If you are looking on the Wikipedia or you have the DVD box set in front of you, then this episode is the first one. But the network actually aired this one toward the end of the show's run, and the second episode, titled The Train Job, actually acted as the pilot for everyone who watched this show as it came out on television. The long and short of it, which you can hear more of the gory details of in the commentary for this episode, is that the Fox network executives did not like the idea that the heroes of this episode at one point backed down during a confrontation with an antagonist. Now this seems very stupid, to put it charitably. I can think of loads of television shows and even movies, yea, even movies from under the banner of the Fox network, where the good guys don't always come out on top. To demand that the creators of this show create an entirely new pilot episode in half the time for this reason alone is a little short-sighted if you ask me. But this is neither here nor there. Right now we're talking about this pilot. This is maybe the greatest pilot episode for a series I've ever seen. It seamlessly sets up everything that can and will be showing up in the rest of the series, but it also tells a story and doesn't really drop any balls along the way. Sometimes with a pilot episode, I feel like the pilot will try to do too much, and I will then lose interest because of the countless characters and things going on with all of them. A great example of this would be in the 2004 Battlestar Galactica revamp. Sometimes, a show just doesn't quite know what it wants to be yet, and if it's a show you like a lot, you might go back to the first episode and say, whoa, they were really trying to find out what they wanted to be right there, weren't they? Some good examples of this would be the first episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, also from Mutant Enemy, and even from a sitcom I enjoy quite a bit, Friends. In contrast to these two things that I sometimes think many pilot episodes are guilty of, I think the pilot episode of Firefly works amazingly well. It doesn't feel inconsistent with what we got later in the series, and it doesn't feel like it only exists to set up the characters and the premise of the series. Sure, there are a few things that are introduced here, like River being kidnapped and rescued, that won't really be explored until much later, but this episode still manages to tell a complete story and a satisfying one, all in the span of an hour and a half. At no point do I really feel like there are any contrivances that this episode goes to just so that the plot can happen in the way that it does happen. It makes sense that Badger tells Mal to go to the border world if the stolen cargo Mal is trying to sell is imprinted by the Alliance. It makes sense that this job is so important to finish, or else the ship can't be refueled or maintained. Every twist and turn that makes the life of the people on the ship more complex feels natural and organic. I also mentioned that this episode shows us exactly what kind of show we will be getting for the rest of the series. The episode gives us the three kinds of villains who we will be seeing throughout the series, and none of them feel forced or feel like they get any more or less screen time than what they need. We get the Alliance, who are really more of a minor inconvenience in this episode than actual full-on villains. But I would submit that the Alliance never fully crosses over into full-on villain territory, or at least the public Alliance doesn't. But I'll get into that later. We also have hints of the more covert private alliance in the form of Dobson and who he might be working for, but I would lump this in with the Alliance, albeit a more sinister version of the Alliance. Then we get the civilian menace, which is arguably the primary kind of antagonist that this series throws at the protagonist, and we get it here in the form of Patience. And we get the Reavers, who I would also say never quite become full-on antagonists. Much like the Alliance cruiser at the beginning of this episode, the Reavers in this episode are really only here to throw a monkey wrench into the best laid plans of Mal and Min, but they aren't a major component of the episode like Patience and her people are. Like I say, this episode, in what I think is a very subtle way, shows us exactly what we have in store for us in this series. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the mythology of this series. The mythology for the show is as dense and as simple as it needs to be. The density comes from what I can only assume is a great deal of material that was put to paper when the people behind this series were creating it, but this material might not have made it into the episode necessarily. My creative writing professor once said that when you create a character, you should create information about that character to help make him feel like a three-dimensional, fully formed character. He also said that usually about 80% of what you come up with won't even make it into the story, but it will still make the character seem real to someone who is reading or watching the story. Now obviously I cannot confirm this one way or another, but when I watch this series I get the feeling that the people behind this show crafted such a deep background for what this universe is like and what each of these characters are like, and we don't even get to see a fifth of that. But the characters still feel very real and fleshed out, for the most part. This kind of work being put into a story just shows how much love the creators have for their work. And while this mythology feels very complex and mysterious, it isn't off-putting. I don't think anybody would watch this and come away confused. We aren't spoon-fed everything, but I don't think we need to be. We are not told the exact differences between a companion and a prostitute, and if we were, it would no doubt slow down the narrative of the episode. All we really need to know is that there are differences, and how this affects some of the characters. We don't need to know the specifics of the war and why it was being fought, since this is not a show about the war. This is different from the Star Wars prequels, which in my video, Fixing the Star Wars Prequels with the Comics Kid 2099, I complained that there was never really a concrete reason why the Clone Wars were being fought, or why the Separatists hated the Republic. But the Star Wars prequels were about a war, and about the people fighting in the war. Firefly is not that. Firefly is about the aftermath of the war. How has the conclusion of the war impacted Mal and his wife, and thusly, how does he impact everyone else on his ship? In fact, not knowing the how and why of the war actually forces us to question these characters a little bit more. I've seen some fans speculate that the war between the Alliance and the Browncoats is supposed to be the science fiction equivalent of the American Civil War, with the Alliance representing the Union and the Browncoats representing the Confederacy. This kind of makes sense because if you recall, after the end of the American Civil War, you had many Confederate officers who decided to pick up and go elsewhere. They did not care for the idea of a government that they fought against having a part of their lives, so they moved to places like Mexico and much further west, where the government didn't quite have the same presence as it did in the eastern states. Check out the John Wayne movie The Undefeated for a somewhat real-life version of this kind of thing in action. Now, I am not going to sit here and say that the Browncoats actually are similar or identical to the Confederacy from the American Civil War, mostly because we are never told in any terms what the Browncoats were fighting for, or what the Alliance was fighting for. So I wouldn't even be able to make the parallels, since there's nothing really to parallel here. But I do think that if we look at the alleged heroes of this show and question just how heroic they actually are, that can make the analysis of this show much more interesting. Now, I think everyone knows that the crew of the ship is not 100% good. After all, almost every episode of this series involves the characters committing some kind of robbery and pulling the wool over the eyes of the forces of law and order in some capacity. I think everyone would agree that although these characters are made to be sympathetic, they are still criminals, and sympathetic is the operative word here. Every time I watch the opening sequence of the pilot episode and Mal finally comes to realize that he has lost the war, I feel a great twinge of heartbreak for him. This is the mark of a good writer, in my humble. Mal is kinda a questionable individual. We are never told if the Browncoats are actually the air quotes good guys, and yet seeing Mal realize that he has lost makes me feel sad for him, even when I know next to nothing about him or his cause. And when you look at the other side of the token, the Alliance are almost always presented as the bad guys, when most of the Alliance soldiers that you see really haven't done anything bad. The worst thing you could say about the public Alliance guys is that they are cold fish and they don't really care about the little people like the crew of the Serenity. But they aren't evil, they're just guys doing their job. This is, of course, not applicable to the Hands of Blue guys. When you flash forward to the present day, the characters on the ship are burglars for no reason other than Mal wants to stick it to the man. I would say that the creators behind this show cheat just a little bit in the way that they make us feel for these characters. Although they are criminals, they make us root for them by throwing worse scumbags at them. Mal may be a thief who has an irrational hatred of the government, but he's at least honorable, which is more than can be said for Patience, or Badger, or Dobson. Now, I should go ahead and say that, although I may sound a little negative toward the characters or the premise for this series, I do not mean to. I just find that the series offers a lot to talk about, and I want to be completely fair and completely objective when I do so. Although most of the time I will sound like a raging, irrational fan of this series, I want to at least be able to say that I did try to look at both sides of this series, the positives and the negatives. In the interest of doing so, I do like most of the characters in this show, regardless of any and all character flaws that they carry with them. I find Mal to be extremely unlikable at times, and that is usually a deal breaker for me. If a character is somebody who I would have no interest in spending time with in real life, then I would usually have no interest in watching stories with that character. That is absolutely true for a character in another Mutant Enemy television show, Buffy Summers. But somehow, Mal, although unlikable quite often, still intrigues me, and I always find myself wanting to watch stories with him. Now, usually I talk a great deal about story, and then as a secondary focus in my reviews, I talk about whether the characterizations presented in the story work in the context of what the story is trying to do. I've already talked a little bit about the characters, and I have more to say yet. But first I want to go ahead and give a quick overview of the story before I forget it. But in this review, I'm not sure if I have a whole lot to say about the story. Like I said, the plot of this episode is pretty straightforward. We see the tail end of a war between the Alliance and the Browncoats at a place called Serenity Valley. Mal Reynolds and his good friend Zoe are there. Flash forward 6 years. Mal is in charge of his own ship, and his crew specialize in stealing. In this case, they're taking cargo from a dead ship floating out in space, and they take it to Badger, the guy who sent them to steal it. Badger doesn't want it thanks to the Alliance logo branded on the cargo. So now it's up to our crew to take the cargo to one of the outer worlds and sell it to someone more desperate than their client, and hope that they don't die doing so. This comes back to how dense I feel like this universe really is, even though we don't get very much information presented to us. I would almost bet money that someone working on this show had detailed descriptions on the history of some of the central planets like Persephone, and then the outer rim worlds like Whitefall. We don't get more than what is needed here, but with how the characters interact with each other and how they react when they decide that they are going to the outer rim, it feels like a real situation. No doubt because I am certain someone made a great deal of detail concerning those worlds to make it feel real. Along the way, Mal decides that the ship will pick up some civilian passengers so that they can earn a little extra money on their way to Whitefall. These passengers are Simon Tam, a young doctor with a secret, Shepherd Book, an older preacher with several secrets, and Lawrence Dobson, an Alliance agent with a secret. His secret being that he's an Alliance agent. The people on the ship have to deal with the agent trying to kidnap Simon's sister, who Simon snuck aboard, and they have to deal with Simon, who won't help save the life of Kaylee, the ship's mechanic, who was shot by Dobson, unless Mal keeps him safe from the Alliance. Okay, it sounds a little bit more complicated than it really is when I say it out loud. But that's basically the story. A group of people going from point A to point B to deliver the goods and not die. Everything else is just a natural extension of the story that usually exists to make things harder for the protagonist to do this very simple plot. Earlier, I was talking about Mal and how likable he is or isn't. I should go ahead and say that although this show is presented like an ensemble show, I really think the show is all about Mal. Even when there are episodes in this series that more heavily focus on other characters, which is to be expected when you have a cast of 9 characters, I still see this show as being about Mal. To that end, I see almost every character on the ship being an extension of Mal. In the opening scene, Mal is an optimistic, jovial man of faith. In the here and now, Wash is the jovial jokester, Kaylee is the optimist of the ship, and Shepherd Book is the man of faith. In the here and now, if Badger is to be believed, Mal's whole reason for living is to keep on pretending that he's still in the war and that the Alliance are his enemies, when it's not that cut and dry. Compare this with Jane, who basically lives to be a contrarian who likes to fight. Granted, he doesn't have a cause like we believe Mal did, but then again, Mal doesn't especially have a cause either. Just being an outlaw is his cause. Then you have the Doctor, who every time I watch the pilot, I feel Mal is unjustly a jerkhole too. Mal is upset that the Doctor has snuck his sister on board when he and his sister are both wanted by the Alliance, and thus he has endangered Mal and his crew. Mal doesn't seem to realize that he has done the exact same thing. He has stolen cargo on his ship, and he decides that this is a good idea to keep this a secret from the civilians that he has brought on board his ship. The only difference is that Mal was not caught, and Simon was, and for this, Mal is relentlessly an anus to Simon. I think part of this could be projection. Mal sees a lot of himself in Simon, and so when he yells at Simon, he's really yelling at the parts of himself that he doesn't like. Simon will do anything for his sister, and has basically ruined his own life for his sister's sake. Mal, well, he hasn't ruined his whole life for the sake of his crew, but he would do just about anything to protect them. Now, of course, this doesn't work with every character. River is kinda in her own little world, and, at least from my perspective, doesn't really have any parallels with Mal. And Nara, while I liked her okay as a character, also doesn't really match up with Mal in any way that I can see. And Zoe, my least favorite character in the whole series, is basically just a mirror to Mal. Literally, anytime Mal has an opinion, Zoe is there to echo it and agree with him. I can think of exactly one episode in the series where Zoe seemed to exist as a character and not as Mal 2.0. And then there was one moment in the movie where she kinda goes head to head with Mal. And I should say, during these moments I like her fine. It's only when she doesn't have any depth at all that I can't stand her. But I do think, for the most part, Mal works as a sort of counterbalance to just about everyone else on the ship. This can be both good and bad, I think. On the one hand, this allows for Mal to interact with almost everyone on the ship in different ways. But also, it makes Mal's character a little unpredictable. If he has X in common with Jane, and also something else in common with Simon, and there's some sort of quibble, does he side with Jane or Simon? This really only seems troublesome to me from a writing point of view. If you have a character who you don't know how he would react to a given situation, because he is a conglomeration of fragments from several other characters, that only makes the job of writing him that much harder. But since I am not a writer for this show, I will say that this makes Mal feel much more like a real person than if you start with a character trait, like the goofy one, and then turn that into an entire character. This review is getting pretty lengthy, and I had a great deal more I wanted to say, specifically about the Reavers and the Alliance. But there is an episode later in this series, as well as the movie, where I will have a chance to talk about the Reavers in great deal, so I will save what I have to say about them for then. Likewise, the Alliance, in both of its forms, shows up several times throughout the series, and in the movie, so I will also save what I wanted to say about the Alliance as well. So I think I will shelve anything I wanted to say about these guys for some of the reviews I will do for the rest of the series. I hope this video found you well, and if it did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to see more in-depth looks at other shows, let me know. I really want to do the same sort of thing for some other shows I have on DVD and enjoy quite a bit, but the enormous size of these shows also makes this a daunting task. So it's something I keep saying maybe someday, and it just keeps getting pushed back. In the meantime, I will try to come back next week with a review of the next episode of Firefly. Until then, keep coming back for videos from me throughout the rest of the week. I'll see you later.